I'm going to show you some samples of slip stitch or mosaic knitting. It's a technique that can allow you to work with more than one color without using more than one color working yarn in each row. It's also a technique that can be used for texture work, to cause some raised stitches in your knitting. So it's not just a color work technique, but mostly what I'm going to cover is about the opportunity to use colors one color at a time to achieve looks like these. Now, this blue sample is slip stitch knitting, and in this case I used the white yarn on these rows, and in between the white stitches I simply slipped the blue stitches purlwise onto my working needle, knit 2 white stitches, slipped the 2 blue stitches, and so on, so that the only yarn I was using to wrap on this row was the white. And then I came back to the beginning of this row to work the blue stitches now. So I'm still on this row, those 2 stitches that I slipped before the white, I knitted, and then I slipped the 2 white, and then I knitted the blue, slipped the 2 white, knitted the blue, and so on across this row. So every stitch in this row was kind of passed over or worked over the course of 2 passes on this same row. And then in between I just put a couple of rows of plain blue before I did that again. And then in this pink example, you can see how the fabric starts to have this raised effect where these sections are here. And the reason that they're raised is because every other row of pink here is stretched over an extra row. So this stitch right here, for example, you can see that it's sort of larger than this white stitch next to it. And the reason for that is that it really belongs, or it started in the same row as the pink stitch below this white one. So it started here, and then when I was working the row of white stitches, I slipped this stitch, and then when I worked the next row, which was in pink, the whole way I worked this stitch here. So I've got the row that it belongs to is up here rather than this in the same row as the white. So it has stretched from the row below the white to the row after the white. And so that's why it's longer here, and that's why it kind of pulls up the fabric. Okay, and then this example up here is where I slipped pink stitches, inserted a white stitch down here in this row, slipped a couple more and inserted a white stitch across. And then when I was working with the pink, I slipped the white stitches each time I came to them for 2 rows. So I'm only using the pink yarn, and every time I got to a white stitch, I just slipped it. And so you can see that these white stitches started in this row here, but only got worked once I got to the 3rd row away. So it's these white stitches are stretched over 2 rows of knitting before they get worked again. So that creates a nice color work technique, a longer dash of white in those. And then in this orange swatch, I alternated. This is the same as the bottom of this pink one. You can see that in between here, the orange sections are a little bit raised, but then I shifted the next set of slipped orange stitches when I inserted the white. And then this one here is an example of the same inserting the white as down here, but then when I was working back with my orange color, I knitted the orange stitches, but then purled the white stitches, knitted the white orange ones, and then purled the white ones. So it just created a texture in the stitches in the color work. So that's another aspect of slip stitch knitting, and it can go on and on. There's so many examples. So earlier I mentioned that sometimes slip stitch knitting is simply a technique for texture. Here's an example of a reversed garter stitch piece of fabric with a slip stitch ridge going up through it. And this is just achieved in every other row. You slip this knit stitch instead of working it as a knit stitch. Pulls it forward, and of course, because it's a knit in a sea of pearls, it gives you a texture. And then another example of slip stitches is in the cuff of this sock. Every time the yarn transitioned from one color to the next, you can slip a stitch and then work a stitch and slip a stitch. Oh, I should turn it over. You can slip a stitch and of the old color, work a stitch of the new color, slip a stitch of the, and so on. And then the next round, you just start working away. So it sort of brings the previous color up a row just because it's stretched over a row from having been slipped. And then on an extreme level, if when you are working slip stitches, you can this slip stitch, these long ones here, originated down here, and when I wrapped these stitches, I wrapped them twice so that I had a lot of extra yarn. So when it comes to slipping these stitches, when I'm working the purple rows and I just need to slip this stitch, I slipped it for 6 garter stitch rows, and every time I came to it, it was just a matter of slipping that. And then once I got back to this lighter color, I worked it, and so it just pulled that slip stitch right up all the way. And then this is also a slip stitch decoration. The ones that you can see that these gray stitches here are elongated because when it came to these pink rows, I worked 2 rows of pink, and then I slipped these gray ones when I came to them. So I was only working with pink yarn and then slipping these gray stitches. So that is a little bit of information about slip stitch or mosaic knitting. It takes many forms, and you can tell that you can see that if you just add some texture or staggered the designs, you can get so many different effects. And so there's all kinds of experiments to be had and patterns to explore. Thank you.